Hello, and welcome back to the Sleep Science series. Tonight, we're going to drift along one of the world's most ancient and life-giving rivers. We're traveling to the land where civilization itself learned to flourish, where deserts met fertile banks, and where people discovered how to live in harmony with the rhythms of nature. Tonight, we explore life along the Nile. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine standing on a riverbank at dawn. The air is cool and still. The first light of morning touches the water's surface, turning it from deep black to silver blue. You can hear the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, the distant call of an ibis bird, and somewhere behind you, the soft sounds of a village beginning to wake. The scent of river water mingles with the earthy smell of wet soil, rich and dark. This is the Nile, the longest river in the world, stretching more than 4,000 miles from the heart of Africa to the Mediterranean Sea. For thousands of years, this river has been more than just water flowing through sand. It has been life itself, the difference between existence and impossibility, between abundance and emptiness. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus, who traveled through Egypt around 2,400 years ago, wrote something that has echoed through the centuries. He called Egypt the gift of the Nile. He wasn't speaking poetically. He was describing a fundamental truth. Without the Nile, there would have been no Egypt as we know it. No pyramids rising against the sky. No temples carved with stories of gods and pharaohs. No cities bustling with craftsmen and traders. No children playing along the banks while their parents tended fields of wheat and barley. Egypt exists within one of the harshest environments on Earth. The Sahara Desert stretches to the west, an ocean of sand and stone where nothing grows. More desert lies to the east, equally barren, equally unforgiving. The sun beats down with relentless intensity. Rainfall is almost non-existent. In most places along the Nile Valley, years can pass without a single drop falling from the sky. And yet, along this ribbon of water cutting through the desert, life flourished in extraordinary abundance. The Egyptians themselves recognized this miracle in their language. They called their land Kemet, which means the black land, referring to the rich, dark soil deposited by the river. Beyond the river's reach lay Deshret, the red land, the lifeless desert that stretched away in all directions. Stand on the boundary between these two worlds, and you can see the line with perfect clarity. On one side, green fields, date palms swaying in the breeze, villages of mud brick homes, children laughing, cattle grazing. On the other side, nothing. Red sand, bare rock, heat waves shimmering in the distance. The contrast is so stark it seems impossible. It's as though someone drew a line across the earth and declared, "Here ends life. Here begins emptiness." But the Nile made the impossible real. Every single year, like clockwork, the river would rise. Waters that began as rainfall thousands of miles away in the Ethiopian highlands would swell the Nile's banks. The flood would come slowly at first, then faster, climbing higher and higher until vast stretches of land disappeared beneath the water. And when the flood finally receded months later, it would leave behind a gift more precious than gold, a layer of rich, black silt, thick with nutrients, perfect for growing crops. This predictable miracle shaped everything about how people lived along the Nile. It dictated when they planted and when they harvested. It determined when they could work their fields and when they turned to other tasks. It influenced their calendar, their festivals, even their understanding of the gods. The Nile wasn't just a river. It was the pulse of an entire civilization, the heartbeat that kept everything alive. Imagine what it must have been like, thousands of years ago, to be among the first people who realized they could live here permanently. Before that, humans had wandered through this region as hunters and gatherers, following animal herds, searching for water. But someone, at some moment lost to history, understood something profound. The river's flood could be predicted. It came every year. It brought water and soil. If you stayed in one place, if you learned to manage the water, if you planted seeds after the flood receded, you could grow food. You could stay. That realization changed everything. By around 6,000 years before the Common Era, people were settling along the Nile's banks in small communities. They built simple homes from the river's reeds and mud. They planted the first crops. They watched the seasons turn and learned the river's rhythms. They began to create something that had never existed before, a civilization rooted to one place, sustained by the understanding that the earth could be cultivated, that nature's patterns could be observed and understood, that humans could work with the river rather than merely survive alongside it. Over the centuries, those small settlements grew. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. The people developed sophisticated methods of irrigation, constructing networks of canals to direct the floodwater where it was needed most. They invented a calendar to track the river's cycles. They created systems of government to organize the distribution of water and land. They built temples to honor the gods they believed controlled the flood. They developed writing to record their history and knowledge. The civilization that grew along the Nile would last for more than 3,000 years, one of the longest continuous cultures in human history. It would produce art and architecture that still inspire wonder today. It would make advances in medicine, mathematics, and engineering that influenced the entire ancient world. And all of it, every single achievement, every monument and scroll and discovery, rested on one foundation, the annual gift of the river. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, we're going to explore what life was actually like for the people who lived along the Nile. Not the pharaohs and priests whose names filled the temple walls. Not the architects who designed the pyramids or the scribes who recorded royal decrees. We're going to walk through the villages where most Egyptians lived. We're going to see how families woke and worked, what they ate, how they celebrated, what they believed, and how they found joy and meaning in their daily existence. We'll follow the rhythm of the river through its 3 great seasons. We'll watch farmers preparing their fields, craftsmen shaping clay and metal, children playing ancient games, families gathering for festivals. We'll hear music drifting across the water at evening and smell bread baking in outdoor ovens at dawn. This is not a story of grand battles or royal intrigue. This is the story of ordinary days made extraordinary by the simple fact that they happen at all, that human beings figured out how to create stable, prosperous lives in one of the most challenging environments on Earth. It's a story about adaptation, community, and the deep connection between people and the natural world that sustained them. So let your breathing slow. Let your body sink more fully into rest. Imagine the gentle sound of water flowing past, steady and eternal. Picture the first light of dawn touching a distant pyramid, then spreading across fields of green grain, finally reaching a village where smoke begins to rise from cooking fires and the day's work is about to begin. Let's travel together now to life along the Nile. Before we visit a village and meet its people, we need to understand the most important pattern in ancient Egyptian life: the 3 seasons. Everything revolved around them. When you were born, when you got married, when you worked in the fields or rested, when festivals were celebrated, when taxes were collected. The entire civilization organized itself around the Nile's annual cycle. The Egyptians called the first season Ake, which means inundation or flooding. It began in mid-July, marked by a celestial event that ancient Egyptians watched for with great anticipation. Just before dawn, the star Sirius would appear on the eastern horizon for the first time after a 70-day absence. The Egyptians called this star Sopdet and associated it with the goddess Isis. When Sopdet rose with the sun, everyone knew the flood was coming. Within days, sometimes within hours of Sirius's return, the Nile would begin to rise. The waters came from far away, from summer rains falling on the Ethiopian highlands thousands of miles to the south. The rain would swell rivers that fed into the Nile, and the surge would travel northward like a slow, massive wave, finally reaching Egypt in mid-July. At first, the change was subtle. The water would be a little higher each morning, a little closer to the fields. But day by day, week by week, the Nile would continue to climb. In some years, the river could rise 45 feet above its normal level. Imagine that, a wall of water taller than a 4-story building, spreading out across the entire floodplain. For months, from July through November, vast stretches of Egypt would be underwater. The villages were built on slightly higher ground, or on artificial mounds called turtlebacks that remained above the flood. From these elevated areas, people could look out and see their world transformed. Where there had been fields and paths, there was now a vast lake stretching to the horizon, dotted with date palms standing in water like islands. This wasn't seen as a disaster. This was the miracle that made life possible. Because when the flood eventually receded, it would leave behind something precious beyond measure, a thick layer of silt. This sediment, carried hundreds of miles from the Ethiopian highlands, was extraordinarily rich in minerals and nutrients. It was dark, almost black, and when spread across the fields, it created soil of exceptional fertility. Modern farmers use fertilizers to replace nutrients that crops take from the soil. Ancient Egyptians didn't need fertilizers. Every single year, the Nile delivered a fresh layer of the finest agricultural soil imaginable, completely free. All they had to do was wait for the water to recede, then plant their seeds in the damp, rich earth. But the flood wasn't uniform. Some years it would be higher than others. If the flood was too low, there wouldn't be enough water to cover all the fields, and the thin layer of silt wouldn't support a full harvest. Famine could follow. If the flood was too high, it could destroy villages, sweep away homes, drown livestock, and cause chaos. The ideal flood was one that rose just high enough to cover the fields thoroughly, remained for the right length of time to saturate the soil, then receded gradually, leaving behind that perfect layer of black silt. The Egyptians developed sophisticated ways to measure the flood. They built nilometers, structures placed along the river with marks showing the water level. Officials would monitor these carefully and send messengers up and down the Nile reporting on the flood's progress. If the water was rising too fast or too slow, preparations could be made. Prayers would be offered to Hapi, the god of the annual flood, asking him to provide exactly what was needed. During Ake, farmers couldn't work their fields. The land was underwater. So this became a time for other activities. Many farmers would take on work for the state during the flood season. In the Old Kingdom, this is when the Great Pyramids were built. Farmers who couldn't tend their crops would travel to Giza or Saqqara, where they would join massive construction projects, receiving food and lodging in exchange for their labor. It was also a form of tax payment, contributing to the pharaoh's great works when agricultural work was impossible. For those who remained in their villages, Ake was a quieter time. A time for repairs and maintenance, for crafting tools that would be needed in the coming seasons, for spending more time with family, for festivals and celebrations. The Opet festival, one of the grandest in all of Egypt, took place during Ake. In this festival, statues of the gods Ammonius, Mut, and Khonsu were carried in a great procession from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple, accompanied by music, dancing, feasting, and celebration that could last for weeks. Then, in November, as the flood began to recede, the second season arrived, Parade, which means emergence or coming forth. This was when the land emerged from beneath the waters, revealing the gift the Nile had brought. Imagine walking out to your fields on that first day when the water had fully receded. The ground would still be damp, almost muddy in places. The smell of wet earth would fill the air. And stretching before you would be your farmland, covered in that layer of rich, black silt, ready for planting. Parade lasted from November through February, and it was the busiest time of the agricultural year. Every able-bodied person had work to do. The fields needed to be plowed to prepare the soil for seeds. In ancient Egypt, plowing was done with simple wooden plows pulled by cattle or oxen. A farmer would guide the plow while the animals pulled it through the soft earth, turning over the soil and creating furrows for planting. Once the field was plowed, the actual planting could begin. Seeds would be scattered across the prepared soil by hand, walking up and down the rows, casting the seeds with practiced motions that ensured even coverage. Then animals, often sheep or goats, would be herded across the field. Their hooves would press the seeds down into the soil, covering them with enough earth to protect them while they germinated. The main crops were wheat and barley, the staples of the Egyptian diet. Wheat was ground into flour for bread. Barley was used to make beer, which was a daily drink for Egyptians of all ages, safer than water and providing important calories and nutrients. But farmers also planted flax for making linen cloth, onions, garlic, lettuce, cucumbers, melons, figs, dates, and various legumes like lentils and chickpeas. Water was critical during Parade. The flood had receded, but the crops still needed moisture to grow. This is where Egyptian ingenuity truly shone. They had developed an irrigation system called basin irrigation, which worked brilliantly with the Nile's flood cycle. During Ake, as the flood covered the land, earthen walls had been built creating large basins or pools in the fields. These basins would fill with floodwater, which would then be held in place even as the river level dropped. The water would slowly soak into the soil, saturating it deeply. When the water was no longer needed in one basin, channels would be opened to drain it into another basin that needed more water. But what about areas that the flood didn't quite reach, or fields that needed additional water as the season progressed? For this, the Egyptians invented a device called the shaduf. Picture a long pole balanced on a pivot, like a seesaw. On one end was a bucket. On the other end was a heavy counterweight, often a large stone or a clay ball filled with mud. A farmer could lower the bucket into a canal or the river, fill it with water, then lift it using the counterweight to help, and swing the pole around to empty the water into a field. The shaduf made it possible to move water to higher ground, extending cultivation beyond the natural reach of the flood. It required effort, no question, but it was far more efficient than carrying water in pots. A skilled worker could move hundreds of gallons of water in a day using a shaduf. As parade progressed, the crops would grow. Green shoots would emerge from the dark soil. The wheat and barley would rise taller week by week. The vegetable gardens would flourish. Children would be sent to watch the fields, chasing away birds that tried to eat the grain, keeping goats from wandering into the crops. It was a time of hope and anticipation, watching the year's food supply literally growing before your eyes. Then, in late February, the third season would begin, Shimu, the time of harvest and drought. This season lasted from February through June, and it was when all that careful planting and tending finally paid off. The harvest was an all-hands-on-deck affair. Men would move through the fields with sickles, cutting the wheat and barley stalks close to the ground. Women and children would gather the cut grain into bundles, tying them together and stacking them. Once enough grain was harvested, it would be transported to the threshing floor, an open area where the grain could be separated from the chaff. Threshing was done by having cattle or oxen walk in circles over the cut grain, their hooves breaking the grain free from the stalks. Then the grain would be winnowed, tossed into the air so that the wind would blow away the lighter chaff while the heavier grain kernels fell back to the ground. It was hot, dusty, exhausting work, but also joyful. The harvest meant survival. Every bundle of grain was security for the coming year. Shimu was also the time when taxes were collected. Egypt's government ran on agricultural surplus. Scribes would come to measure the harvest, calculate the amount owed, and collect a portion for the pharaoh's storehouses. These central granaries ensured that everyone could be fed even in lean years, and supported the craftsmen, priests, soldiers, and administrators who didn't farm. By June, as Shimu reached its end, the Nile would be at its lowest point. The fields would be dry, almost hard, baked by the sun. Work would slow. The intense heat made midday labor nearly impossible. People would rest in the shade during the hottest hours, conserve their energy, and wait. Because any day now, Sopdet would rise again on the eastern horizon. The flood would return. Ake would begin once more. And the cycle that had sustained Egypt for thousands of years would turn again, reliable as sunrise, as dependable as the stars themselves. This pattern, these 3 seasons, provided more than just an agricultural calendar. They gave life a rhythm, a structure that connected each generation to the ones before and after. Your great-great-grandmother had planted seeds in Parait and harvested in Shimu. Your great-great-granddaughter would do the same. The river, in its endless cycling through flood and emergence in drought, bound everyone together in a shared experience that transcended individual lives. When we talk about ancient Egypt as a civilization that lasted 3,000 years, this is part of why the fundamental pattern of existence didn't change. The river could be trusted. The flood would come. The harvest would follow. This created a stability, a confidence that tomorrow would be much like today, that allowed culture and knowledge to accumulate and deepen over centuries. As you rest now, imagine that rhythm. The rising water, the emergence of land, the growth of crops, the gathering of harvest, the quiet wait, and then the rising water again. Like breathing, in and out, rise and fall, growth and rest. Over and over, year after year, century after century, for longer than most nations have existed, the river and the people moved together through time. Let that rhythm slow your own breathing. Let it carry you deeper into rest. The Nile still flows today, just as it did 5,000 years ago. Some patterns are so ancient, so fundamental, that they connect us across time to people who lived unimaginably long ago but who, in the most important ways, were not so different from us. They woke to sunlight. They worked and rested. They loved their families. They celebrated good fortune and endured hardship. And they did it all beside a river that, in its endless flowing, promised that life would continue. Let's visit one of those villages now and see what a day in the life might have been like. The sun hasn't quite risen yet, but the sky is lightening from black to deep blue. In a village along the Nile, the first sounds of morning begin to stir. A rooster calls. A dog barks somewhere in the distance. From one of the houses comes the scraping sound of someone grinding grain. This is a farming village in Middle Egypt, during the New Kingdom period, around 3,000 years ago. The village consists of perhaps 30 or 40 families, their homes clustered together on a slight rise above the floodplain. The houses are built from sun-dried mud bricks, the same material people in this region still use today for its excellent insulation properties. In the blazing heat of an Egyptian summer, a mud brick house stays surprisingly cool inside. Let's follow one family through their day. Their home is modest, 2 or 3 rooms opening onto a small courtyard. The walls are thick, windowless in most places to keep out the heat, with small openings near the roof to let smoke from the cooking fire escape. The doorway is low, requiring everyone to duck slightly when entering or leaving. This, too, helps with temperature control, keeping the cool air inside. The father, whose name is Kamwasit, is already awake. He's in his early 30s, lean and tan from years of working outdoors, with the broad shoulders that come from guiding a plow and wielding a sickle. He wears a simple linen loincloth, wrapped around his waist and knotted at the front. In the cooler months he might wear a longer kilt or a loose shirt, but in the heat of Shimu, less clothing is more practical. Kamwasit steps out into the courtyard, where the night's relative coolness still lingers. He stretches, feeling his muscles wake, then walks to the back of the house where water is stored in large clay jars. He pours water over his hands and face, washing away the night. Cleanliness is important to Egyptians. Most will bathe at least once a day, either at home in basins or in the Nile itself. His wife, Merit, emerges from the house carrying their youngest child on her hip. She's a year or 2 younger than Kamwasit, her dark hair braided and her slim body draped in a simple linen dress that reaches from chest to ankles, held up by two straps over her shoulders. Merritt sets the child down in the courtyard where he can play safely, then moves to the corner where the grinding stones are kept. Making bread is a daily task, usually done in the morning while it's still relatively cool. Merritt kneels beside the saddle quern, a large, flat stone with a slight concave surface. She pours a measure of barley or wheat grains onto the stone, then picks up a smaller, rounded stone called a rubber. Using both hands, she pushes the rubber back and forth across the grains, crushing them gradually into flour. It's hard work, and it will take the better part of an hour to grind enough grain for the day's bread. Her shoulders and arms are strong from doing this every morning for years. As she grinds, Merritt can hear the village coming to life around her. From the house next door, she hears her neighbor's voice singing softly, perhaps to a child. From farther away come the sounds of animals, the low of cattle, the bleating of goats. Somewhere a child laughs. Dogs bark and chase each other between the houses. Their older children begin to wake. The oldest is a daughter named Nefertari, 11 years old. She helps her mother immediately, fetching water from the jar to mix with the flour. Their son, Taotep, is 9. He's responsible for checking on the family's few animals, a couple of goats and some chickens. He stumbles out sleepy-eyed but dutiful, heading to the small enclosure where the animals are kept at night. Once Merritt has ground enough flour, she mixes it with water to form a dough, adding a pinch of salt if they have it. The dough is kneaded until smooth, then formed into flat, round loaves. These are placed on a large flat stone that sits over the fire pit. In wealthier homes, there might be a clay oven, but most families use this simpler method. The bread cooks quickly, and soon the wonderful aroma of fresh-baked bread fills the courtyard. While the bread cooks, Merritt prepares the rest of breakfast. This might include some onions, perhaps some dates or figs if they have them, maybe a little cheese. And there will be beer. Egyptian beer is different from modern beer, thicker, sweeter, with a lower alcohol content. It's made from partially baked barley bread that's crumbled into water and left to ferment. The result is nutritious and safer to drink than river water. Even children drink it, as it's a significant part of their calorie intake. The family gathers in the courtyard to eat. They sit on reed mats on the ground, using no utensils except perhaps a knife to cut the bread. They eat with their hands, tearing off pieces of bread to scoop up onions or dip in oil. It's a simple meal, but satisfying. The bread is still warm, the beer cool from being stored in the shadiest part of the house. As they eat, Kamwasit discusses the day's work with Taotep. It's Shimu, late in the season, and most of the harvesting is done. But there's still work to be done in the fields, clearing away the stalks, preparing the ground for when the flood comes again. Taotep will come with his father today. At 9 years old, he's old enough to help with real work, and it's important that he learns the skills he'll need as an adult. Nefertari, meanwhile, will stay home with her mother. She's learning the skills women need: grinding grain, baking bread, weaving linen, managing the household. In a few years, she'll likely be married, setting up her own household, and she needs to know how to run it efficiently. The youngest child, only 3 years old, will stay with Merit or perhaps be watched by an elderly grandmother who lives in the house next door. Egyptian families are tight-knit. Multiple generations often live close together, helping each other with childcare and work. After breakfast, the day's work begins in earnest. King Lasset gathers his tools, a hoe for clearing the ground, a carrying basket, a water jug. Taotep takes a smaller hoe, eager to prove himself useful. Father and son walk together out of the village toward the fields. The sun is fully up now, climbing into a sky of cloudless blue. It's going to be a hot day, as most days are in Egypt. But right now, in the early morning, the air is still pleasant. A breeze comes off the river, carrying the scent of water and wet earth. As they walk through the village, they greet neighbors. Egypt is a polite society, with strong social norms about respectful behavior. Everyone knows everyone else. Children are taught from a young age to respect their elders, to help their families, to be honest and kind. These aren't just moral principles, they're seen as necessary for maintaining Ma'at, the cosmic order and balance that keeps the universe functioning properly. At the edge of the village, King Lasset pauses and looks out across the land. In the distance, the Nile gleams in the morning light, its surface already busy with boats moving up and down. Closer, he can see his fields, the grain already harvested but the land still showing signs of the year's work. Beyond the fields, farther from the river, the green of cultivation gives way to the tan and red of the desert, that inhospitable land where nothing grows. He takes a breath of the morning air, offers a quiet word to Hapi thanking the god for the flood that will come, and to Osiris for the fertility of the land. Then he sets to work, his son beside him, participating in the pattern that has sustained his family and his people for more generations than anyone can count. Back at the house, Merit and Nefertari have their own work. After cleaning up from breakfast, Merit turns to the weaving. Most Egyptian clothing is made from linen, which comes from the flax plant. Processing flax into thread and weaving that thread into cloth is time-consuming work, and it's primarily done by women. Merit has a simple loom set up in the courtyard, where the light is good. She sits before it, her hands moving with the practiced ease of someone who has done this since childhood. Nefertari watches and helps, learning the patterns, the tension, the way the threads must cross to create a strong, even fabric. As they work, they talk. Merit tells stories, some about their own family, some about the gods, some just amusing tales to pass the time. This is how knowledge is passed down in a culture where most people can't read or write. Stories carry history, values, practical wisdom. They connect each generation to the past and provide guidance for the future. The morning passes peacefully. The sun climbs higher. The heat increases. By midday, outdoor work will become difficult. This is the rhythm of an Egyptian day. Start early, work hard in the morning, rest during the intense heat of midday, resume work in the late afternoon when it cools slightly, finish as the sun sets. It's a life that to modernize might seem hard. There are no machines to ease the labor. Everything is done by hand, by human or animal muscle. The heat is intense. Illness and injury can't be treated with modern medicine. Life expectancy is shorter than what we're used to. And yet, watching this family through their mourning, what stands out is not hardship but something else, contentment, perhaps. or at least a kind of quiet acceptance. They know their place in the world. They know what's expected of them. They have their family, their community, their patch of earth beside the river. They eat adequately, usually. They have work that is meaningful, producing the things they and others need to survive. They have rituals and festivals to mark the seasons. They have stories and songs and moments of joy. In the courtyard, as Merritt weaves and Nefertari learns, the youngest child plays with simple toys: a clay ball, a wooden spinning top, a little toy boat made from bundled papyrus reeds. His laughter rings out bright and clear. His mother smiles, glancing over to make sure he's safe. The chickens peck around the courtyard, searching for insects. From somewhere nearby comes the sound of someone singing. The Nile flows on, as it always has. The sun climbs higher. Another day unfolds along the river, much like yesterday, much like tomorrow will be, part of a pattern stretching back through centuries and forward into a future the people of this village can't imagine but trust will come, reliable as the flood, certain as the stars. Let's follow Kamwasit and Taotep as they make their way to the fields. The path they walk has been used for generations, worn smooth by countless feet. It winds between low irrigation ditches and past the carefully maintained earthen walls that separate one family's land from another's. Agriculture is the foundation of everything in ancient Egypt. Perhaps 90% of the population farms. From the grain they grow comes the bread that feeds everyone. From their surplus comes the wealth that pays for temples, tombs, armies, and all the other structures of the state. Without successful farming, the whole civilization collapses. Every farmer knows this. The weight of that responsibility is something they carry from childhood. Kamwasit's land is not large, perhaps a few acres, passed down from his father. It's not technically his land in the sense we might think of ownership. In ancient Egypt, all land technically belongs to the pharaoh, representative of the gods on earth. But in practice, families maintain control of specific plots generation after generation, as long as they fulfill their obligations, producing crops, paying taxes, providing labor when required. The field is located in the prime growing area, close enough to the river that the flood always reaches it, but high enough that the water doesn't linger too long after the inundation ends. The soil here is the legendary black earth, that gift of the Nile, deep and rich. Right now, in Lake Shimu, the field has been harvested. Cut stalks and stubble remain, along with some grain that escaped collection and is already sprouting. The ground is hard and dry, baked by weeks of relentless sun. Kamwasit and Taotep spend the morning clearing the field of debris. They use hoes to chop at the stubble, breaking it up so it will decompose more quickly when the flood comes. It's physical work, and the sun is already warm even though it's still morning. Father and son work side by side, falling into an easy rhythm. Kamwasit occasionally offers guidance, how to angle the hoe for maximum efficiency, where to step to avoid tripping, when to pause and drink water. These moments of working together are important. Taotep is learning more than just how to clear a field. He's learning patience, persistence, the value of doing a job thoroughly even when it's tedious. He's learning to read the land, to understand the soil, to see the subtle signs that indicate where the water will pool when the flood comes and where it will drain away too quickly. Around mid-morning, They take a break in the shade of a palm tree at the field's edge. Camlosset passes the water jug to his son, and they sit together looking out over the land. In the distance, other farmers are visible, also at work in their fields. A group of women walks past carrying baskets on their heads, perhaps heading to market or visiting relatives in another village. Camlosset tells Taotep about his own father, who worked these same fields and taught him these same skills. He talks about years when the flood was perfect and the harvest abundant, and other years when the flood was low and they had to ration carefully. He talks about the importance of saving seed grain, of never eating it all no matter how hungry you might be, because without seed there can be no next harvest. These aren't lectures. They're stories, conversations, the natural passing of knowledge from one generation to the next. This is how farming families have always worked, children learning by watching and doing, absorbing not just techniques but values, understanding not just how to farm but why it matters. By noon, the heat has become intense. Father and son head back to the village, their morning's work done. They'll rest during the hottest part of the day, then perhaps return in the late afternoon when it cools slightly, or turn to other tasks that can be done in shade. As they walk home, Camlosset feels a deep satisfaction. The work is hard, yes, but it's meaningful. He's feeding his family. He's fulfilling his obligations to the pharaoh and the gods. He's teaching his son. He's participating in the ancient pattern that has sustained his people for longer than anyone can remember. When he looks at his fields, he doesn't just see dirt and stubble. He sees life itself, the foundation of everything. Not everyone in ancient Egypt was a farmer. While agriculture formed the foundation of the economy, every functioning society needs specialists, people who make the tools farmers use, who create the pottery for storing grain and water, who weave the linen for clothing, who build the boats for traveling the river, who craft the jewelry and amulets people treasure. Let's visit the workshop quarter of a larger town, perhaps in Thebes during the New Kingdom. Here, narrow streets wind between workshops where the sounds of hammering, grinding, and weaving fill the air. The smell of wood smoke mixes with hot metal, wet clay, and dye. In one workshop, a potter named Senub works at his wheel. He's in his 40s, with powerful arms and hands permanently stained by clay. His workshop is open to the street on one side, allowing passers-by to watch him work. His wheel is a simple device, 2 stone discs connected by a wooden axle, the lower disc larger and heavier. He kicks the lower disc to get it spinning, then centers a lump of clay on the upper disc and begins to shape it. His hands move with practiced confidence. In a few minutes, a shapeless lump becomes a perfect bowl with walls of even thickness and a smooth, curved profile. He cuts the finished bowl free from the wheel using a thin wire, then sets it aside to dry. Later, it will be fired in a kiln to harden it permanently. Senub makes many kinds of pottery, storage jars for grain and oil, cooking pots, serving dishes, small containers for cosmetics and medicines, oil lamps, even toys for children. His products are essential. Without pottery, daily life would be nearly impossible. And while the work might seem simple to someone watching, it requires years of practice to develop the skill to center clay perfectly, to maintain even wall thickness, to judge when a piece is dry enough for firing. Next door to Senub's workshop is a jeweler's shop. The jeweler, a woman named Mutemlia, works with materials that would have seemed impossibly precious to most Egyptians: gold, silver, semi-precious stones like turquoise and carnelian. She's making a necklace, carefully drilling tiny beads of faience, a glazed ceramic material that the Egyptians created in brilliant blues and greens. Mutemlier uses tools that are remarkably sophisticated for their time: fine metal drills, small hammers and chisels, tweezers, and measuring devices. She works by the light coming through the doorway, supplemented by oil lamps on cloudy days. Her hands are steady as she threads the beads onto a cord in a precise pattern. Most of Mutemlia's work is commissioned by wealthier clients, temple priests, government officials, successful merchants. But she also makes simpler pieces, amulets of protective gods that even ordinary people might save up to buy, copper rings and simple bracelets. These aren't mere decorations. Egyptians believe that jewelry can offer magical protection, especially amulets depicting gods like Bes, who protects households and children, or Taurid, the hippo goddess who helps women in childbirth. Further down the street is a weaving workshop where several women work at looms. Weaving linen is time-consuming work, and most families do some weaving at home for their own needs. But professional weavers can produce finer cloth and more complex patterns, creating linen so fine it's almost transparent, reserved for the wealthy and for temple use. The women work side by side, their hands moving in practiced rhythms as they pass shuttles back and forth through the vertical threads of the loom. They talk as they work, sharing news and gossip, singing occasionally. This is skilled labor, but it's also social time, an opportunity for women to gather and strengthen community bonds. In a workshop across the way, a carpenter named Amenhotep shapes wood for furniture. Wood is relatively rare in Egypt, most having to be imported from Lebanon or other forested regions, so skilled carpentry is highly valued. Amenhotep is currently making a bed frame, joining pieces with wooden pegs and dovetail joints. He uses copper tools, saws, chisels, adzes. His workshop smells of fresh wood shavings. What's striking about all these craftsmen is their pride in their work. This isn't mindless labor. Each person is creating something useful and, in many cases, beautiful. They're solving problems, making decisions, exercising creativity and judgment. When Senab shapes a perfect bowl, or Mutemlia strings a necklace with exactly the right balance and weight, or the weavers produce cloth of exceptional fineness, they feel satisfaction in work well done. Many of these skills are passed down within families. Senab learned pottery from his father. Mutemlia's mother was also a jeweler. The young girls working at the looms are learning from their mothers and aunts. This creates a continuity of knowledge, techniques refined over generations, secrets of the trade carefully guarded and transmitted only to trusted family members or apprentices. There's also a strong sense of professional identity. Craftsmen of the same trade often live and work near each other, forming guild-like associations. They look out for one another, share resources, maintain standards of quality. A carpenter who does shoddy work will find himself criticized by other carpenters and might lose customers as a result. Perhaps the most famous community of craftsmen in ancient Egypt was Deir el-Medina, a village built specifically to house the workers who constructed and decorated the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. These were the elite craftsmen of their day, the best stone carvers, painters, plasterers, and architects. The workers at Deir el-Medina left behind remarkable records, thousands of ostraca, limestone chips used as notepaper, on which they wrote everything from work rosters to shopping lists to personal letters. These documents give us an incredibly detailed picture of their lives. We know they worked an 8-day week, with a 2-day weekend. We know what they were paid: grain, beer, vegetables, oil, fish, and occasionally bonuses like linen or sandals. We know they sometimes went on strike when payments were late. We know the names of their wives and children. We know they had neighborhood disputes and family dramas, just like people anywhere. What comes through clearly is that these craftsmen took immense pride in their work. They were creating tombs for eternity, decorated with paintings and carvings that would last for thousands of years. The quality of their work is extraordinary. Modern archaeologists still marvel at the precision of the stone cutting, the vibrancy of the pigments, the skill of the artwork. But even ordinary craftsmen in ordinary towns shared something of this same pride and dedication. The potter making storage jars, the weaver creating linen for everyday wear, the carpenter building a simple stool, they all understood that their work mattered. They were contributing to their community's well-being, using skills that took years to master, creating objects that would be used and valued. As the afternoon wears on in the workshop quarter, activity gradually slows. The heat of the day makes fine, detailed work more difficult. Some craftsmen continue, but others pack up their tools, cover their works in progress, and head home or to the market to trade their wares for food and other necessities. Tomorrow they'll return and continue, shaping, carving, weaving, hammering, creating the thousands of objects that make civilization possible, one careful piece at a time, their hands carrying forward traditions stretching back through countless generations, building not monuments for eternity, perhaps, but something equally important, the material culture of daily life. As evening approaches, many people make their way to the marketplace. In ancient Egypt, money as we know it doesn't exist. There are no coins, no paper currency. Instead, people use a barter system, trading goods and services directly for other goods and services. Let's step back and look at how people filled their days beyond the immediate necessities of work. Ancient Egyptians weren't working every moment. They had leisure time, and they valued joy, community, and celebration. Children, when not helping with household tasks or learning trades from their parents, played games that would be recognizable to children anywhere. Archaeological excavations have uncovered toys, balls made of leather stuffed with reeds or straw, wooden spinning tops, dolls made from clay or scraps of cloth with movable arms and legs, miniature animals carved from wood. One popular game was Senet, a board game played on a grid of 30 squares. Players moved pieces according to throws of stick dice, trying to be the first to move all their pieces off the board. The rules aren't entirely clear to us now, but we know Senet was enormously popular, played by everyone from pharaohs to farmers. Sets made of expensive materials with gold and ivory have been found in royal tombs, while simpler versions scratched into stone or drawn in sand would have served for everyday play. The marketplace is a lively place. It might be set up in an open area near the river, or along a main street, or in the forecourt of a temple. Vendors spread their wares on mats or arranged them on simple tables, vegetables fresh from the fields, dried fish from the river, pottery, baskets, linen cloth, sandals, cosmetics, amulets, oils, beer, bread. Merritt, the woman we met at dawn, has come to the market with her daughter Nefertari. She brings some of the linen she's woven in a basket of onions from their small garden. She's hoping to trade for some fish, perhaps a new cooking pot to replace one that cracked recently, and maybe some fresh dates if any are available. The marketplace is more than just economic exchange. It's a social gathering place. Merritt greets friends and neighbors. She stops to chat with a woman she knew as a girl, comparing notes about their children and husbands. She admires a neighbor's new baby. She hears news: someone in a nearby village is getting married. A merchant from the north passed through yesterday with exciting goods from distant lands. The overseer of the local irrigation district is planning repairs to a canal. When Merritt finds a fisherman whose catch looks good, they begin to negotiate. She examines his fish carefully. Are they fresh? The eyes should be clear, the smell not too strong. She gestures to her linen and onions, indicating what she's willing to trade. The fisherman considers. He names an amount, so much fish for a portion of her cloth and perhaps some onions. Merritt counters. Too much cloth for that amount of fish. They negotiate back and forth, friendly but firm. Eventually they reach an agreement that satisfies both. The fisherman wraps her fish in a large leaf. Merritt hands over a length of linen and several onions. Both parties nod, satisfied. While this might seem inefficient compared to modern cash transactions, the barter system had advantages. It required people to interact face-to-face, creating and maintaining social relationships. It kept wealth more evenly distributed since goods had to be actually produced or bartered for rather than accumulated as abstract money. And it connected people directly to the real value of things. A fish is a fish, cloth is cloth, the worth is obvious. Of course, for larger transactions or more complex trades, the Egyptians did have a unit of account called the deben, a measure of weight in copper or silver. Something might be valued at 5 deben of copper worth, and equivalent goods could be exchanged. But in everyday village markets, direct barter was the norm. The marketplace is also where news spreads. Someone mentions that a royal messenger passed through yesterday, heading north with urgent business. There's speculation about what it might mean. Someone else reports that the flood this year looks like it will be a good one. Water levels upstream are rising nicely. This is discussed with interest and relief. A good flood means a good harvest next year, which means everyone eats well. Children run between the stalls, sometimes on errands for their parents, sometimes just playing. An older woman sits in the shade selling amulets and charms. Another sells cosmetics, kohl for darkening the eyes, ochre for coloring the cheeks and lips. These aren't frivolous luxuries. The kohl has practical value, protecting eyes from the harsh sun and repelling insects. As the sun begins to set, the market starts to wind down. People head home carrying their purchases and trades. Merritt and Nefertari walk back through the village, past houses where smoke is beginning to rise from evening cooking fires, past children playing a last game before bed, past neighbors sitting outside enjoying the cooler air. The Nile itself, always visible, always present, reflects the orange and pink of sunset. Boats that have been moving up and down the river all day are mooring for the night. Fishermen pull their vessels onto the shore. A few late workers are still in the fields, finishing tasks before darkness makes work impossible. This daily commerce, this buying and selling and trading, is how village economies function. The river itself is the great highway, connecting village to village, town to city, allowing goods to flow up and down Egypt. Boats carry grain north to the delta, timber south from the coast, luxury goods from abroad. Local markets distribute these goods at the village level, while also serving as social hubs where community bonds are reinforced with every transaction. Children also played physical games. They played a form of leapfrog, ran races, wrestled, played tug-of-war. Paintings and reliefs show children in acrobatic poses, performing handstands and flips. Some games mimicked adult activities, children playing at farming, at building, at being priests performing rituals. Through play, they were also learning, absorbing the roles they would take on as adults. Music was everywhere in ancient Egypt. Professional musicians performed at festivals and in temples, but ordinary people also made music as part of daily life. Instruments included harps of various sizes, from small portable ones to large standing harps taller than a person. There were flutes made from reeds, drums made from stretched animal skins, sistrums, a type of rattle particularly associated with the goddess Hathor, and tambourines. Songs accompanied work, rowing songs for boatmen, grinding songs for women making flour, harvest songs for workers in the fields. The rhythm of music helped coordinate group efforts and made tedious tasks more bearable. There were also songs for celebrations, for religious festivals, for mourning the dead, for celebrating births. Dancing was equally important. At festivals, professional dancers would perform elaborate routines, their movements preserved in temple reliefs and tomb paintings. But ordinary people danced too, at weddings, at harvest celebrations, whenever there was cause for joy. The movements were graceful and expressive, with complex arm gestures and poses. Storytelling was perhaps the most universal form of entertainment. In the evenings, families would gather and someone, usually an elder, would tell stories. Some were tales of the gods, how Ra the sun god traveled across the sky each day and through the underworld each night, how Osiris was murdered by his brother Set and brought back to life by his wife Isis, how Horus avenged his father and claimed his rightful throne. Other stories were more earthly, tales of clever farmers who outwitted greedy officials, of brave soldiers, of wise scribes, of lovers and their trials. These weren't just entertainment. They carried lessons about how to live properly, how to be a good person, how to maintain Ma'at in your daily life. Egyptian society was built around community. Extended families lived close together, often in connected houses or compounds. Multiple generations would collaborate on daily tasks. Grandparents helped care for children. Cousins worked together in fields or workshops. Aunts and uncles provided support during difficult times. Neighbors, too, formed tight bonds. In villages where everyone knew everyone else, reputation mattered enormously. If you needed help, if your harvest was poor one year, if you fell ill, if your roof needed repairs, neighbors would assist you. The expectation was that you would do the same for them when they needed it. This mutual interdependence created strong social cohesion. People couldn't survive alone. You needed your family, your neighbors, your community. This wasn't just practical necessity, it was a deeply held value. The Egyptians believed that harmony and cooperation were cosmic principles, part of Ma'at. Disrupting community harmony through selfishness or conflict wasn't just antisocial, it was viewed as threatening the very order of the universe. Disputes did arise, of course. Property boundaries might be contested, or someone might fail to repay a debt. When conflicts couldn't be resolved informally, people could appeal to local councils of elders or, for more serious matters, to regional officials who served as judges. Egyptian law was generally practical and aimed at restoring balance rather than punishment for its own sake. What stands out in records of Egyptian daily life is the importance of simple pleasures and social bonds. After a day's work, people would sit outside in the evening air, talking with neighbors, watching children play. They would share beer and bread. They would sing songs. They would tell jokes and laugh together. Life was not easy by modern standards. People worked hard. They faced uncertainties. Would the flood be adequate? Would the harvest be good? Would illness strike? Would conflict disrupt their peace? But within those constraints, they created lives rich with meaning, connection, and moments of joy. The rhythms of their days, waking with the sun, working through the morning, resting during the heat, resuming work in the afternoon, gathering with family in the evening, connected them to the natural world in ways we've mostly lost. They lived by the river's rhythms, the sun's rhythms, the season's rhythms. Their lives were woven into patterns larger than themselves, patterns that gave structure and meaning to existence. To understand life along the Nile, we need to understand how deeply religion permeated every aspect of existence. The ancient Egyptians lived in a world that was fundamentally magical and divine. The gods were not distant abstract concepts. They were present, active forces that shaped daily reality. Every home had a shrine, usually just a simple niche in a wall where small statues or images of household gods were kept. The most popular was Bes, a dwarf god with a leonine face, often depicted sticking out his tongue. Bes protected homes and families, particularly women in childbirth and young children. His fierce appearance was meant to frighten away evil spirits and bad luck. Another beloved household deity was Tauret, the hippopotamus goddess. She too protected women during pregnancy and childbirth, which in ancient times carried significant risks. Small amulets of Tauret were common, worn as protective charms. Each day, family members might leave small offerings at the home shrine, a bit of food, some beer, incense if they could afford it. These weren't grand rituals. They were simple acts of devotion, maintaining a relationship with the gods who watched over the household. The Nile itself was divine. Hapi was the god of the annual flood, depicted as a pot-bellied man with breasts, symbolizing fertility and abundance. When the flood came, prayers and offerings would be made to Hapi, thanking him for his gift. If the flood seemed too low or too high, people would appeal to him for adjustment. Sobuk, the crocodile god, embodied the power and danger of the river. Crocodiles were both revered and feared. In some regions, they were considered sacred incarnations of Sobuk and were worshipped in special temples. In other areas, they were hunted as dangerous predators. This ambivalence reflected Egyptian understanding that the divine was neither wholly benevolent nor malevolent, but powerful and requiring respect. Osiris, god of the dead and resurrection, was particularly important to farmers. His mythical death and rebirth mirrored the agricultural cycle, The cutting down of grain at harvest was Osiris's death. The sprouting of new crops from planted seeds was his resurrection. This identification between the god and the agricultural cycle made farming itself a sacred act, participation in cosmic renewal. People also sought divine guidance for everyday decisions. Should I take this journey? Will my sick child recover? Is this a good day to start a new venture? Priests could be consulted, but ordinary people also had their own methods of divination, reading dreams, watching for omens in the flight of birds or the behavior of animals, consulting calendars that marked lucky and unlucky days. The concept of Ma'at, often translated as truth, justice, or cosmic order, was central to Egyptian religion and ethics. Ma'at represented the proper balance and harmony of the universe. When Ma'at prevailed, the sun rose each morning, the Nile flooded each year, crops grew, society functioned smoothly, and people treated each other fairly. Maintaining Ma'at was everyone's responsibility, from the pharaoh down to the humblest farmer. You maintained Ma'at by being honest, by treating others with respect, by fulfilling your obligations, by speaking truth, by not being greedy or cruel. Living virtuously wasn't just being a good person, it was participating in keeping the universe properly ordered. The opposite of Ma'at was Isfet, chaos, disorder, injustice, falsehood. Isfet threatened constantly to undermine the world's stability. Every lie told, every act of cruelty, every instance of greed or selfishness fed Isfet. This gave moral behavior cosmic significance. Your daily choices mattered not just to you and your community, but to the stability of reality itself. This worldview created a strong ethical framework. You might be tempted to cheat a neighbor or lie to avoid responsibility. But doing so wasn't just personally wrong, it weakened Ma'at and strengthened Isfet, threatening everyone and everything. The gods themselves were subject to Ma'at. Even Ra, the supreme sun god, had to maintain Ma'at in his daily journey across the sky. If the gods failed to uphold Ma'at, the cosmos could collapse. This meant that humans and gods were, in a sense, partners in maintaining existence. The gods needed human worship and offerings to maintain their strength, while humans needed the gods' power and protection to survive. Death was not the end but a transition. Egyptians believed that with proper burial and ritual, the deceased would continue to exist in the afterlife. The quality of that existence depended partly on how you had lived, whether you had upheld Ma'at, told truth, been kind and just. This belief shaped how people lived. The famous declaration of innocence that souls had to make before Osiris in the afterlife included statements like, "I have not caused pain. I have not made anyone weep. I have not killed. I have not commanded to kill. I have not stolen. I have not cheated in measuring grain. I have not taken milk from the mouths of children." These weren't just religious ideals. They represented how Egyptians believed people should actually behave in daily life. Ordinary Egyptians didn't have elaborate tombs like pharaohs and nobles. But they still practiced burial rituals, placing the deceased in simple graves with a few possessions for the afterlife, some food, perhaps tools or jewelry, small protective amulets. The living would visit these graves periodically, leaving offerings and saying prayers to help sustain the deceased. This intimate relationship with death and the afterlife might seem morbid to modern sensibilities. But for Egyptians, it provided comfort. Death was not oblivion but continuation. Your ancestors remained part of the family, watching over you, able to be communicated with. And when your time came, you would join them, continuing the patterns of life and relationship that had sustained you in this world. Religion, then, wasn't a separate sphere of life for ancient Egyptians. It was woven into everything: how you woke up, how you worked, how you treated others, how you celebrated, how you faced challenges, how you understood death. The divine and the mundane were inseparable, each giving meaning to the other. Throughout the year, the rhythm of work and rest was punctuated by festivals, occasions when the ordinary patterns of life gave way to celebration, spectacle, and communal joy. These weren't minor observances. They were major events that could last for days or even weeks, when normal work stopped and entire communities participated in elaborate rituals, feasting, and entertainment. The greatest of all festivals was the Opet Festival, celebrated during Ake, the season of inundation, when fields were underwater and farmers were free from agricultural labor. This festival honored Ammonius Re, the supreme god whose temple complex at Karnak was one of the largest religious structures ever built. The Opet Festival centered on a grand procession from Karnak Temple to Luxor Temple, about 2 kilometers away. The statues of 3 gods, Ammonius Re, his consort Mut, and their son Khonsu, were placed in special ceremonial boats called barks. These ornate vessels, covered in gold and decorated with ram's heads, the ram being sacred to Ammonius, were carried on poles by priests. The procession moved through the streets of Thebes, accompanied by music, dancing, and the jubilant participation of the populace. Drummers kept rhythm. Singers chanted hymns. Dancers performed elaborate routines. The air filled with the sound of sistrums rattling, cymbals clashing, and the voices of thousands of people celebrating. In later periods, the sacred barks were placed on actual boats and floated up the Nile from Karnak to Luxor, making the journey part of the spectacle. The riverbanks would be lined with people watching the divine procession pass. At Luxor Temple, sacred rituals took place, including ceremonies that symbolically renewed the pharaoh's divine authority and his connection to Ammonius Re. The pharaoh participated in rituals in the temple's inner chambers, emerging reborn and re-legitimized as the god's representative on earth. But the Opet Festival wasn't just for priests and pharaohs. Records indicate that temple officials distributed enormous quantities of food and drink to the gathered crowds. One text mentions distributing over 11,000 loaves of bread and nearly 400 jars of beer during a single festival. This was feasting on a massive scale, provided by temple storehouses and by the pharaoh's generosity. For ordinary people, festivals like Opet were opportunities for joy and indulgence. The normal constraints of work and daily routine were suspended. People would wear their finest clothes, paint their faces with cosmetics, perfume themselves with scented oils. They would eat and drink more abundantly than usual. They would sing, dance, flirt, and celebrate. Festivals also reinforced social cohesion. Everyone participated together, from the pharaoh himself down to the poorest farmers. The sight of the god statues, usually hidden away in the dark inner sanctums of temples, was a rare privilege. During festivals, the divine became visible and present in a way that wasn't possible in ordinary life. Another major festival was Weepa Trenpet, opening of the year, which marked the Egyptian New Year. This festival coincided with the heliacal rising of Sirius and the beginning of the Nile's flood, the moment when Sirius appeared on the eastern horizon just before dawn after being invisible for 70 days. This astronomical event was treated with great importance because it predicted the flood's arrival. When Sirius rose, the flood was coming. The new year was beginning. It was a time of renewal and fresh starts. Weepa Trenpet was associated with Osiris and his resurrection. Just as the flood renewed the land, Osiris's rebirth symbolized the possibility of renewal for all. The festival included rituals of purification, the extinguishing of old fires and lighting of new ones, and celebrations that welcomed the new agricultural year with hope and optimism. The Festival of Drunkenness, dedicated to the goddess Hathor, was exactly what its name suggests, a celebration where excessive drinking was not just permitted but encouraged as a form of religious observance. This might seem strange from a modern perspective, but the Egyptians understood that altered states of consciousness could bring people closer to the divine. Music, dance, and intoxication combined to create ecstatic experiences where participants felt the goddess's presence directly. These weren't chaotic bacchanals. They were structured rituals, but ones that allowed for emotional and physical expression in ways that ordinary life generally didn't. Valley Festival, or the Beautiful Festival of the Valley, took place during Shimu and honored the dead. In this festival, the statue of Ammonius would be carried from Karnak to the west bank of the Nile, visiting the mortuary temples of deceased pharaohs. Families would visit the graves of their own deceased relatives, bringing food and drink, essentially having picnics with the dead, maintaining bonds across the boundary between life and death. What's striking about all these festivals is how they combine the sacred and the joyful. Religion wasn't solemn duty. It was celebration, community gathering, feasting, music, and pleasure. The gods were honored through human joy. Making people happy, well-fed, and entertained was itself a form of worship, maintaining the ma'at that pleased the gods and sustained the cosmos. Festivals also provided breaks from the hard realities of agricultural labor. The ancient Egyptian agricultural calendar was demanding. But scattered throughout the year were these moments of celebration when work stopped, when abundance was shared, when the divine presence was made manifest through ritual and community gathering, when life's difficulties were temporarily forgotten in collective joy. As you rest tonight, imagine being part of one of these festivals. You're standing in a crowd of thousands along the Nile's bank, watching the sacred barks float past. Music fills the air. The smell of incense mingles with roasting meat and fresh bread. Children laugh and run between the adults. Someone hands you a cup of beer, cool and refreshing. The sun is setting, turning the river golden. And you feel connected to your neighbors, to your traditions, to the gods, to the great rhythms of life that have sustained your people for generations beyond counting. This is celebration that is also prayer, pleasure that is also devotion, community that is also cosmos. As the sun descends toward the western desert, the heat of the day finally breaks. The air cools. A breeze comes off the river, carrying the scent of water and wet earth. Shadows lengthen across the fields and villages. The quality of light changes, becoming softer, more golden, painting everything in warm tones. This is the time when families gather for the evening meal. In Kamwaset's home, Merit has been preparing dinner. The courtyard's fire pit, which has been kept low through the hot afternoon, is now built up again. On a flat cooking stone over the flames, she makes fresh flatbread, just as she did this morning. But the evening meal is typically more substantial than breakfast. There might be a stew of lentils cooked with onions and garlic. Perhaps some fish, either from this morning's market visit or dried fish from storage. If they're fortunate, there might be dates for dessert, or some figs, or honey cakes as a special treat. The family sits together in the courtyard as they did at breakfast, but now in the gentler light of evening. Kamlasset tells Merritt about his day in the fields. She shares news from the marketplace. Taotep talks excitedly about helping his father, proud of the work he accomplished. Nefertari shows her mother the progress she's made on a piece of weaving she's been working on. These family meals are important. They're when knowledge is passed down, when values are taught, when family bonds are strengthened. Children learn by listening to their parents talk, how adults discuss problems, make decisions, treat each other with respect. After the meal is finished and the dishes cleared away, there might be a little more time before sleep. Sometimes the family stays in their own courtyard, perhaps working on small tasks by lamplight, repairing a tool, mending clothes, preparing materials for tomorrow's work. Other times they might go outside, sitting with neighbors who are also enjoying the cooler evening air. Someone might have a harp or flute and play music. Stories might be told. News and gossip shared. Laughter rings out in the growing darkness. Look up at the sky as night falls. The stars are beginning to appear, first one, then a handful, then thousands. For Egyptians, the night sky was not just beautiful but meaningful. They knew the constellations and tracked their movements through the year. They watched for Sirius, whose rising marked the new year. They observed the moon's phases, which guided their religious calendar. The Milky Way stretching across the sky was seen as a celestial river, a parallel to the Nile itself. Some believed it was the path the sun god's boat traveled during the night, making its journey through the underworld before emerging again at dawn. As darkness deepens, oil lamps are lit. These simple clay vessels filled with oil, with a wick providing light, cast a warm, flickering glow. It's not much light by modern standards, enough to see faces and movements, but not to do detailed work. But it's enough. In wealthier homes, the evenings might include entertainment, musicians hired to play, professional storytellers performing epic tales. But in ordinary homes, the family itself provides the entertainment, finding pleasure in simple conversation, in being together after the day's separate labors. Children grow drowsy. The youngest has already fallen asleep in Merritt's arms. Nefertari's eyes are heavy. Even Taotep, so full of energy this morning, is yawning now. The parents carry their children inside to sleeping mats spread on the floor. Egyptian beds are simple, wooden frames strung with woven cord or leather straps, with headrests instead of pillows. But many ordinary families simply sleep on mats on the floor, which in the heat is actually more comfortable. Before sleep, there might be a final prayer or quiet word to the household gods, thanking them for the day's protection and asking for their continued blessing. Then, finally, sleep. Outside, the village gradually grows quiet. Cooking fires burn down to embers. Conversations trail off. One by one, lamps are extinguished. The sounds of human activity give way to the sounds of night, insects chirping, a dog barking in the distance, the eternal whisper of the river flowing past. The Nile itself continues its endless journey, carrying water from the highlands thousands of miles away down to the sea, just as it has for millions of years, just as it will continue long after every person currently alive has passed into memory and then beyond memory. Standing by the river at night, you could look up at the same stars Egyptian ancestors saw thousands of years before. You could hear the same sound of water against the shore. The connection across time becomes tangible. The river is a bridge not just across space but across centuries. Tomorrow the sun will rise again. The same cycle will repeat. Work, rest, meals, family, community, the slow turn of seasons guided by the river's rhythms. Another day in a pattern that has sustained human life in this place for longer than almost anywhere else on Earth. For now, though, rest. Let the day's end bring peace. Let the darkness bring rest. Let the eternal flowing of the river carry you gently into sleep. We've traveled through a single day along the Nile, but in doing so, we've glimpsed something much larger, a civilization that lasted for 3,000 years, longer than almost any other human society. To understand why Egyptian civilization endured so long, we have to understand what we've seen today. The foundation was environmental, the Nile's predictable flood creating agricultural abundance in the midst of desert. But abundance alone doesn't create civilization. Many places have resources but never developed complex societies. What made Egypt different was how people organized themselves around the river's gift. They developed sophisticated irrigation systems, multiplying the flood's benefits. They created a calendar to track the river's cycles. They built social structures, from family to village to region to kingdom, that coordinated labor and distributed resources. They invented writing to record knowledge and transmit it across generations. But perhaps most importantly, they created meaning. The river wasn't just water, it was divine blessing. Agriculture wasn't just work, it was participation in sacred cycles of death and renewal. The pharaoh wasn't just a ruler, he was the link between human and divine, maintaining Ma'at that kept the cosmos ordered. This investment of meaning transformed survival into culture. It meant that knowledge wasn't just practical, it was sacred and needed to be preserved. It meant that traditions weren't just habits, they were connections to eternal patterns and required to be maintained. This is why Egyptian civilization changed so slowly. In many cultures, change is valued, seen as progress. But for Egyptians, the patterns established by ancestors and gods were perfect. They had discovered how to live in harmony with the river, with the seasons, with the cosmos. Why change what worked? This conservatism sometimes held them back. Their technology advanced slowly. Their social structures remained largely static. But it also gave them stability. While other ancient civilizations rose and fell, conquered and were conquered, fragmented and reformed, Egypt endured. The same gods were worshipped, the same river flooded, the same fields were planted, generation after generation after generation. The people we visited today, Kamwaset the farmer, Merit his wife, their children, the craftsmen in their workshops, the vendors in the marketplace, they were part of a continuity that stretched back through thousands of years. Their great-great-great-grandparents 100 generations removed had lived much the same way. Their descendants 100 generations hence would live much the same way. This continuity is almost unimaginable to us. We live in a time of rapid change, where each generation experiences a world dramatically different from the one before. But for Egyptians along the Nile, change happened so gradually as to be almost imperceptible. The world of your childhood was essentially the same as the world of your old age. There was comfort in this. Uncertainty was minimized. You knew what to expect. You knew your place in your role. You knew that if you worked hard and lived virtuously, the river would provide, the harvest would come, and your children would inherit the same stable world you'd known. But there was also constraint. If you were born a farmer, you would die a farmer. If you were born in a certain village, you would likely live your entire life within a few miles of it. Social mobility, possibility, the chance to become something radically different from your parents, these concepts barely existed. We can't say whether Egyptian life was happier or more fulfilling than modern life. Happiness is subjective, culturally constructed, impossible to measure across time. What we can say is that their lives had meaning, connection, purpose. They were part of something larger than themselves: family, community, civilization, the eternal rhythms of the river and the cosmos. When the flood came each year, it was the same flood their ancestors had watched for centuries. When they planted seeds, they used techniques perfected over millennia. When they celebrated festivals, they performed rituals established in the deepest past. When they died, they expected to join ancestors in an afterlife that was, in many ways, a continuation of the life they'd known. The ancient Egyptian language had no word for history in our sense, events progressing linearly from past to future. Instead, they spoke of things happening in the first time, a mythic era when the gods established the patterns of existence. All of subsequent time was essentially repetition of those original patterns. History wasn't linear progress but eternal cycle. This worldview, so different from our own, shaped everything about how Egyptians lived. It made tradition sacred. It made innovation suspect. It made stability the highest value and change something to be resisted or at least minimized. Eventually, of course, Egypt did change. Foreign conquerors came: Persians, Greeks, Romans, Arabs. The old gods faded. The temples fell silent. The language itself eventually died out, replaced by Coptic and then Arabic. The complex hieroglyphic writing system became indecipherable, its secrets locked away for centuries until modern archaeology and the Rosetta Stone unlocked them again. But the Nile continues. It still floods, though now controlled by dams. It still provides water and life. Egyptian farmers still plant and harvest, though with modern tools. The land itself remembers. When we study ancient Egypt, we're not just examining a dead civilization. We're encountering a fundamentally different way of being human, a different relationship to time, to nature, to the divine, to community, to death. It challenges us to question our own assumptions. Must life be oriented toward change and progress? Is stability stagnation or wisdom? What do we gain with our mobility and possibility? What do we lose? The family we follow today, waking with the sun, working in the fields, sharing meals, telling stories, offering prayers, finding joy in simple pleasures, they would be unrecognizable to us in many ways. Their beliefs, their values, their worldview diverge radically from modern Western perspectives. And yet, in the most fundamental ways, they were like us. They loved their children. They worried about providing for their families. They found pleasure in food, music, friendship. They sought meaning in connection. They faced mortality and wondered what comes after. They looked up at the stars and felt wonder. They stood beside the river at sunset and felt peace. These essential human experiences transcend culture and time. When we imagine life along the Nile, we're not just learning history. We're connecting across the centuries to people who were different from us but also deeply, fundamentally similar. The river flows on, as it always has. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. The seasons turn. And somewhere, in some form, life continues along the Nile's banks, shaped by its waters, sustained by its gift, connected to patterns so ancient they seem eternal. As you drift into sleep tonight, carried by these images and stories, let yourself feel that connection. You are part of the same human story that includes those Egyptian families. You share their wonder at the world, their love for their families, their hope for the future, their faith that tomorrow the sun will rise and life will continue. The river flows. The stars will overhead. The patterns repeat, eternal and comforting. And you, floating on this stream of time, can rest in the knowledge that you are part of something larger, older, deeper than any individual life, part of the great human story that began when our ancestors first settled along rivers like the Nile and continues still, flowing forward into an unknown but connected future. Sleep now, peaceful and content, carried by the eternal river of time. Good night.